The polls are not looking good for President Trump right now, and Joe Biden is obviously up in several states. But one of the most prescient people from the 2016 election, Michael Moore, is saying that, hey, hold on a second, it's not a done deal. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Never take Trump for granted. If anybody is sitting at home right now thinking, oh, man, we've got this one in the bag. Whoa, did you hear him today? He said he's done more for black people than Abraham Lincoln. Whoa, we're going to win. Yeah. No, I'm telling you, I'm warning you, and I'm begging you. Please, do not sell this man short. It doesn't matter what Trump does. They are going to show up. And they're counting on their rage and their emotion is so much stronger. But they have the courage of their convictions. You know, they believe. And they're counting on us not showing up in that same way.
I mean, I think Michael is absolutely right, because we should always remember, which is that in the past polling that we see on Biden, it's all very tepid. He has the lowest enthusiasm of a Democratic nominee, I think, in modern history. Trump, on the other hand, has double the amount of enthusiasm amongst the people who are going to come out or is excited in order to vote for him. I think it's somewhere in the 54% range of the people who support him. And so that tepid support, as we've covered here, the reason that we cover, Biden's, problems with minority communities, problems with younger voters and all these others, is that if the election were to turn against him, if it were to be tight, this is the groups from which it would come from. It's not necessarily in the Obama-Trump voters. Those people are pretty solidly behind Trump. There hasn't been a lot of movement in that particular demographic. But that Trump's level of enthusiasm with his own voters is something which is extraordinarily politically potent. And we've covered here, Krystal, in the past, and I think we have some of the polling as well. Biden has big problems amongst minority communities, Latinos in particular, and especially young Latinos.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He is way behind where Hillary Clinton was last time around with that group in particular, something that Harry Enton was tracking. I was just kind of chuckling to myself watching that clip and imagining President Trump becoming like a big Michael Moore fan now.
He tweeted it out. He tweeted out that clip. Yeah,
I was gonna say,
that's how I found it.
He retweets it out. There you go. Question answered. He already did it. Look, I always listen when Michael Moore does political analysis, because of all the people that they trot out on cable news, he's one of the only ones who has any sort of feel for the Trump phenomenon, called it last time accurately. And look, that doesn't mean that he's going to be right every time. But I think he has his finger on the pulse much more so than almost anyone else that they bring on cable news to opine on these things, because of his deep Michigan roots and how much that, that trade and that dissatisfaction really became the defining feature of 2016 on the right. And then on the left, the defining feature was this sort of ambivalence, right? You had a lot of people who didn't show up, especially, working class people in minority communities, especially young voters. They're sort of like, lesser two evils. I'm not really feeling too inspired by either of these choices, so I'm just going to stay home. And by the way, many of them don't regret that choice ultimately. So yes, while I think we both agree, if election is held today, very, very likely that Joe Biden wins. I think President Trump's handling of or failures to handle the coronavirus crisis adequately, especially on the economic front. I think his failures to be a real uniting leader during the George Floyd protest movement, that has really shaken a lot of his support loose as well and put Biden in a very commanding position. But, that complacency that we saw in 2016, where people really felt like Hillary Clinton had this in the bag, that is very much a danger. The lack of enthusiasm is very much a danger. And then, as we've talked about, as President Trump gets back into the rallies, as we start to maybe move towards more of a normal political season and, debates and those sorts of things, these are not areas where Joe Biden does particularly well. So while, yes, Biden right now has a commanding lead, I think it's very likely that he wins. I think, between President Trump's numbers and also the 80% of Americans who say that the country's out of control, the 74% who say we're on the wrong track, these are all dire numbers for President Trump. But no one should count him out, because it's a long time between now and November. Joe Biden could easily make some massive mistakes that really hurt him. And, one thing President Trump, we've seen time and time again where he kind of, walks up right up to the edge and then pulls himself back and is able to kind of rescue himself ultimately.
I always tell people that. Yeah, I'm like, do not underestimate this person. We've seen him. I've seen him at these approval ratings before, and he'll bounce back up to 47, 49%. And it's something that, especially if you see him back out on the campaign trail, he's returning, I believe, next week on June 20th in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That puts him at least in a better parity with Biden. I've never thought that, the reason that he's been doing rallies basically for his entire presidency is that, A, it's uninterrupted television time, but B, I think that is kind of his natural medium with people. It's not, from the Oval Office via, like the stultified being president, whereas the Biden dynamic is exactly the opposite. Whereas Biden is doing much better when he's irrelevant to the public conversation, just sitting in the basement allowing public opinion to do whatever he wants. And the more that you see from Biden, I'm not saying that this will lose him the election, but I don't, obviously the polls are not going to be this close whenever we head to the ballot box. So we're entering a new phase of the campaign trail, and it's always important to keep Michael's analysis there in mind.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the one other thing I would add is the other time during Trump's presidency when we saw a significant approval rating shift against him, because overall, during his presidency, his approval ratings have been pretty consistent, right? They haven't gone up that much. They haven't gone down that much. The one exception was his handling of Charlottesville. And he took a significant hit from the, very fine people on both sides moment and, sort of refusing to change from that stance. He took a real hit in the approval rating at that moment, but ultimately it bounced back to where it had been, right?
Took like a month.
So
yeah.
Even as you feel like this particular moment is so huge, and it is in a lot of ways when you see protests and uprisings in every city in the country, and you see attitudes shifting so dramatically, so quickly on Black Lives Matter, on race, on policing. It's easy to feel like this is going to persist. I would caution against that, though, because if there's one thing that we have learned time and time and time again during this era, it is how quickly the ground can shift out from under you, how dramatically things can change overnight. And that is certainly a possibility here heading into, the summer before the election.
I think that's exactly right. All right, we'll have more Rising for you after this.